The rain hammered the pavement outside the little lantern, a narrow window of warmth that smelled of roasted beans and the faint metallic tang of wet concrete. I slipped the umbrella from my arm, watching the dark droplets race each other down the glass, and pushed the door open with the practiced precision of someone who never lets a deadline slip. The bell above the door gave a tinny jingle that cut through the murmur of conversation, and the barista glanced up, eyes hidden behind a fringe of steam-stained hair. I took my usual seat in the corner, a high-backed leather chair that squeaked just enough to remind me I was still human, not a piece of furniture. My notebook lay open on the table, pages already crowded with bullet points about the gala, the promotion, the endless spreadsheet of contacts I'd have to charm. My hands moved automatically, smoothing the crisp edge of my blazer as if that could iron out the knot of anxiety coiled in my chest. The scent of rain-soaked wool from my coat seeped into the air, mixing with the espresso's bitter perfume. "Do you want a refill?" The voice was low, almost a growl, and I looked up to see a man in his early 30s nursing a chipped mug, his fingers wrapped around it like a talisman. The scar on the back of his left hand was barely hidden by the cuff of his shirt, a pale line that caught the light when he lifted the cup. He wore a muted charcoal jacket that seemed too big for his frame, shoulders hunched as if to protect something beneath. "My thanks," I replied, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Just a black, please." My voice sounded louder than I intended, the cadence of a public speaker rehearsing a pitch. I was careful to keep the tremor out of my tone, though my mind raced with the contract I'd just signed, a paper promise that felt more like a shackle. He set the mug down with a soft thud, the sound echoing against the wooden tabletop. I caught the ghost of a scent, something animal, faintly musky, like damp pine after a storm. My eyes flicked to the scar again, tracing the jagged edge with a quick, almost clinical glance. It reminded me of the stories my mother used to tell about Wolf, my mother, the one who left without a word when I was 12. The one who taught me that attachment was a liability. My fingers tightened around my pen, nails biting into the wood. "You look like you could use something stronger," he said, voice softening just enough to slip past the clatter of cups. "First time in this part of town?" I forced a laugh, the sound edged with the practiced confidence of a senior editor who could negotiate contracts with billion-dollar authors and never miss a beat. "I'm just trying to stay awake for a meeting. The city never sleeps, but my brain does." He raised an eyebrow, the motion making the scar catch the light again. "You work in publishing?" "My last name is Monroe. I'm a senior editor at Blackthorn Press. I'm close to a promotion, so I have to look presentable at the gala." I paused, noting the way his eyes lingered on the sigil faintly inked on the inside of my left wrist, an invisible mark I'd felt the moment I'd signed the contract. "And you?" He shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm a handyman. Lots of odd jobs. I'm looking for work that doesn't ask too many questions." He tapped the mug with a fingertip, the sound muted by the foam that had settled on the rim. A clatter came from the kitchen, a tray of pastries teetering before a hand slipped it away. The barista, a young woman with a tattoo of a crescent moon on her wrist, placed a croissant in front of me. The buttery layers folded under my fingers as I broke off a piece, the warm steam mingling with the rain's chill that seeped through the window. "Ryder Quinn," he introduced, extending a hand that was calloused but steady. The grip was firm, the pressure deliberate, and for a split second I felt the faint vibration of something wild beneath his skin, as if his pulse beat in a rhythm different from any human heart. "Ryder." I shook his hand, the contact sending an unexpected jolt up my arm. "Eliza Monroe. Nice to meet you, Ryder." My voice landed on the edge of something my brain categorized as flirtation, though my mind catalogued it as a transaction. He stared at the sigil on my wrist, his brow furrowing. "That's odd. You sure you want to wear that?" I lifted my sleeve just enough to show the faint silver line that seemed to catch the light in a way that made it look almost alive. "It's a part of the contract. I'm doing a one-day marriage." You know, a formality. His eyes narrowed, the scar flashing again as his jaw tightened. And you paid someone to what? Rent a husband for a night? The words slipped out faster than I could edit them, a mixture of sarcasm and genuine curiosity. The broker said it would solve a problem. I need to appear married for the gala. It's efficient. He let out a low chuckle that sounded like gravel shifting under a weight. Efficient. That's a word I don't hear often in this line of work. He scanned the room, taking in the mismatched furniture, the chalkboard menu with today's specials, maple bacon latte, cold brew, seasonal scones, and the rain painting streaks across the window. You ever hear about the old stone circle outside Ashbourne? Supposed to be a place where contracts are bound. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, the rain's rhythm on the glass sinking with an unconscious thrum in my ears. My brother's an urban legend geek. He's probably read the whole myth already. I'm more interested in whether the broker is legit than in folklore. He cocked his head, the muscles under his hair moving like shadows. You have a brother? I hesitated, the question tugging at a thin thread of memory. A brother who'd left home before I could ask why, a woman who'd replaced the emptiness with deadlines. No, I'm an only child. He nodded, as if the answer fit into a larger puzzle he hadn't yet seen. I'm an only child too. The confession seemed to linger in the air, caught between the steam from our coffees and the rhythm of the rain. A man in a dark coat slipped into the coffee shop, his eyes scanning the room with a predatory focus. He lingered near the door, his hand resting on a leather satchel that bulged with something metallic. I caught a flash of a symbol etched into the metal, a logo I didn't recognize, but that sent a chill up my spine. Ryder's gaze shot to him, eyes narrowing to slits. The scar on his hand seemed to tighten, as if the skin itself were bracing. Did you see that? I whispered, leaning in so my breath brushed his ear, the scent of his cologne, a faint cedar and something wild mixing with the coffee. He pressed his thumb against his lips, the gesture deliberate. He's not part of the shop. He's watching. His voice was low, almost a growl, and the air between us seemed to thicken. I glanced back at the man, who now stood with his back to the wall, the coat buttoned up tight. He lifted a phone, the screen glowing briefly, and then pocketed it, turning to leave as silently as he had arrived. A shiver ran through me, not from the cold but from the certainty that something larger than my contract was already circling. Ryder stood, his chair scraping softly against the wooden floor. I think we should finish our coffee and get out of here. He reached for his mug, the motion smooth, his hand brushing against mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The contact sent a ripple through my skin, making the scar on his hand feel like a bruise, an echo of something deeper. I set the croissant down, crumbs scattering like tiny brown snowflakes onto the table. I have a meeting in 20 minutes. I can't stay. His eyes flicked to the clock above the counter, the neon digits blinking 7:45. Excuse me, he said, voice softer now, as if he were trying not to break a fragile surface. Do you have a car? I hesitated, the thought of being stranded in this rainy city feeling suddenly unsafe, despite my years of navigating Manhattan's endless maze. I have a ride share, but I'm not sure if I should. He cut me off, his tone edged with an urgency I couldn't parse. You're coming with me. There's a thing we need to settle before sunrise. It won't take long. The words were loaded, a promise of time bound by an unseen clock. My mind raced through the internal checklist: promotion, the gala, the contract's expiration at midnight, the looming fear that if I walked into that room alone, I would be exposed. Yet another list formed, the one that whispered of betrayal, of a man whose intentions felt like a threat as much as a convenience. Look, I said, the city's wind whistling through the cracked window. I'm not the kind of person who walks into something without a plan. I tapped the notebook on the table, the paper rustling like a nervous whisper. Ryder stared at the notebook, his gaze lingering on the title page, Gala Draft, May 12. He let out a breath that seemed to exhale a scent of pine resin, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't name. "You have a plan. I have a problem." He hesitated, the scar on his hand catching the light once more, a glint that felt like a warning. Outside, a car horn blared, a distant siren wailed, and the rain intensified, as if the city itself were urging us forward. I felt the weight of the contract's sigil like a pulse beneath my skin, a reminder that my freedom was already compromised. Yet the idea of leaving this coffee shop with a stranger, with an unknown scar, felt like stepping into a new story, one where I could finally rewrite the lines my mother had left unfinished. "Fine," I said, standing, the leather chair groaning behind me. "But we do it my way. I'm taking a cab, and you'll have to follow my schedule." My voice cracked slightly, a small tremor that I hoped no one noticed. He nodded, the scar on his hand flexing as he pushed his chair back. "Deal." He rose, moving toward the door, the rain splashing against the glass as the door swung open. The man in the dark coat lingered at the threshold, his eyes locking on mine for a heartbeat before he vanished into the street, swallowed by the downpour. I followed Ryder out into the wet, the cold air slapping my face, the city lights reflecting off the puddles like scattered diamonds. The street was a river of umbrellas, each one a tiny island of fabric against the storm. Ryder's coat was heavy, the fabric dampening as it absorbed the rain, and I could see the faint outline of a silver wristband tucked just beneath his cuff, the metal catching the streetlights. We walked in silence for a few blocks, the sound of our footsteps mingling with the patter of rain. I could feel the rhythmic thump of his heart through the jacket, a steady beat that seemed both human and something else. My mind flickered back to the contract, the promise of a one-night marriage, and the way the broker had smiled too wide, teeth flashing with a certainty that felt like a lie. Ryder stopped at a crosswalk, his eyes scanning the traffic. He turned to me, his face illuminated by a street lamp, shadows carving deep lines around his jaw. "Your brother, what's his name again?" I hesitated, the name a fragile thing I hadn't spoken in years. "I don't have a brother." The lie slipped out smooth, rehearsed, a safeguard against the vulnerability that threatened to surface. He raised an eyebrow, the scar catching the light again. "Interesting. You're good at keeping secrets." The light turned green, and we stepped into the stream of cars, the rain washing over us as we merged into the flow. The cab I'd ordered screeched to a halt a block away, its worn exterior a stark contrast to the sleek black sedans that passed by. I glanced back at the coffee shop, its warm glow a distant memory, the barista still wiping down tables, unaware of the tangled threads that had just begun to pull. Ryder pulled the door open for me, his hand lingering on the handle a moment longer than necessary. Inside, the backseat smelled faintly of leather and gasoline, the hum of the engine a low, steady rumble. He slid into the passenger seat, the seatbelt clicking into place with a soft snap. "Where to?" he asked, his voice low, the words slipping out like they were spoken in a different tongue. I stared out the window at the rain-slicked streets, the city's neon signs blurring into streaks of pink and teal. "Ashbourne, you said there's a stone circle. I need to see it before the contract ends." My fingers twitched around the edge of my notebook, the paper warm from the heat of my hand. He turned his head slightly, the profile of his jaw illuminated by the streetlight. "Ashbourne is far. And you sure you want to go?" The question hung between us, heavy with implication. I met his gaze, the reflection of my own eyes in the dark glass of the windshield. "I have nothing to lose, except maybe everything." The rain hammered the roof, each drop a percussion that seemed to echo the thudding of my heart, a rhythm I tried to disguise behind a thin veneer of sarcasm. He smiled, a hint of something softer emerging beneath the stoic exterior. "All right, Eliza Monroe. Let's see where this night takes us." The car pulled away, the city receding behind us, the storm swallowing the streets as if trying to erase the path we'd just begun to tread. The rain had stopped by the time the van pulled up on the gravel behind the cabin, but the air still hummed with the leftover chill of the storm. I lifted my hand to the door, feeling the metal latch cold against my fingertips, and hesitated a heartbeat before pulling it open. The pine walls seemed to breathe the faint, sap-sweet perfume, and a thin veneer of frost clung to the windows, catching the weak amber of the street lamp beyond. Inside, the fire pit in the stone hearth crackled, sending up a spray of orange that painted the low ceiling in fleeting strokes. I slipped my coat off, the fabric sliding off my shoulders with a soft sigh of rubber soles on pine. My notebook, still half filled with gala ideas, thudded against my thigh as I crossed the threshold, the weight of the silver sigil on my wrist suddenly a hot brand against my skin. Ryder was already there, his back against the far wall, a battered toolbox propped beside him like a reluctant companion. He ran a gloved hand over the ancient runes etched into the timber, the lines glowing a muted green as if reacting to his touch. I caught the scent of pine resin mixed with something metallic, blood, perhaps, or the faint afterglow of his transformation earlier that night. He didn't look up. "Looks like you've already made yourself comfortable," I said, trying to thread humor through the tightness in my chest. The words landed flat, the crackle of the fire filling the space where I expected a laugh. He finally turned, the scar on his left hand catching the firelight, a thin crescent of reflected flame. "It's a cabin, not a hotel. There's not much to make comfortable." His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He gestured to a narrow cot near the window. "You can take that. It's the only place to sleep that isn't the floor." "I'm not staying the night," I replied, though the words felt like a rehearsed line I'd used for meetings. My eyes flicked to the runes again, noting how they pulsed brighter as I spoke, green flares that seemed to mirror the tension in my voice. The cabin's walls were alive with their own quiet commentary, and I could feel each lie I told dimming the light like a wave receding. He stepped closer, his boots thudding softly on the pine, and placed a hand on the cot's edge. "You should rest. The road back to the city is a long way, and the next full moon will be in less than 24 hours. We don't know how long the contract will hold us." He didn't finish the sentence, as if the idea of a longer stay made the runes flicker an angry, bright white. I swallowed, the air tasting of damp wood and the faint metallic tang of the sigil. "I have a flight tomorrow morning," I said, the lie slipping out as easily as I'd signed the contract. I glanced at the notebook on my lap, the pages fluttering in the draft of wind that slipped through the cracked window. My fingers traced the outline of the gala schedule, the annotated margin where I'd penciled "Talk to Sponsor" in bold ink. Ryder's gaze lingered on the notebook, and for a moment I saw a flicker of recognition, an editor's mind reading a planner as easily as a wolf reads a scent trail. "You're always planning," he murmured, the comment more observation than teasing, "even when you're about to get married to a stranger." The humor I tried to inject died in my throat. I pressed the edge of my sleeve against the sigil, feeling it pulse faintly, like a second heart beating in time with my own. "I'm not marrying," I corrected, the word tasting sour. "It's a contract, a legal formality. It ends at midnight." He lifted his eyebrows, the scar catching the firelight once more. "And you think a contract can be broken with a pen stroke?" I found my voice steadier than I felt, the practiced cadence of a senior editor taking control of a meeting. "The broker said it's a one-day thing, no magic beyond a symbolic line. I have a lawyer ready to file a termination clause." I pulled the notebook closer, the paper rustling like a warning. He let out a half-laugh that sounded more like a growl. "Your lawyer must know a lot about folklore." He moved to the wood stove, his hand hovering over the flames, the heat brushing his cheek. "You really don't know what you've signed up for." A sudden gust rattled the shutters, and the runes on the far wall flared a vivid green, casting an eerie light on the floorboards. I stared at them, the glow painting my own shaking hands in a sickly hue. "What do they do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The runes react to truth," he said, his tone softer now, as if he were explaining something he'd said 1,000 times to himself. When you lie, they blaze. Honesty dims them. He turned his head, his eyes catching the flicker of his own reflection in the window, wolf-gray eyes that softened for a brief second before hardening again. I felt a sudden urge to test it, to see if the runes would light up for the lie I'd just told. I lifted my left hand, the sigil pulsing brighter, and whispered, "I'm scared of being alone." The runes flared a harsh green, illuminating the cabin's interior like a warning sign. I stared at the light, the truth of the statement hitting me harder than any physical blow. Ryder's expression shifted, the usual guarded composure cracking just enough for me to see the concern flicker across his features. "You're not alone now," he said, and for a second the runes dimmed, a soft, amber glow settling over the walls. The change was subtle, but the cabin seemed to breathe out a sigh with it. I let my hand fall to my side, the weight of his words settling like a stone in my gut. The notebook felt heavier, the pages suddenly full of unfinished chapters. I glanced at the cot, the thin blanket draped over it, and the thought of the morning flight seemed far less pressing than the scent of pine and the low, steady rhythm of Ryder's breathing. He moved to the small kitchen area, opening a tin of beans with a quick twist of his wrist. The clatter of metal against metal was sharp, and the smell of stale oil rose from the pot. "You hungry?" he asked, holding out a spoonful of beans. The gesture was oddly domestic, the way a wolf might bring a wounded pack member a piece of meat. I hesitated, my pride warring with a sudden, unfamiliar craving for comfort. I reached for the spoon, feeling the heat of the beans against my palm. "I'm not used to this," I admitted, the words tasting like ash. "I'm used to elevators, conference rooms, deadlines." He smiled, a small, crooked thing that didn't quite reach his eyes but softened the line of his jaw. "I'm used to fixing things." He tapped the toolbox, the clink of metal echoing off the runes. "Sometimes the things that need fixing aren't broken, they're just hidden." The beans sloshed against my tongue, warm and oddly satisfying. I watched the fire's orange tongues lick the stone hearth, each crackle sounding like a heartbeat. The cabin, with its ancient symbols and the rhythmic pulse of the runes, felt less like a prison and more like a living thing that demanded honesty. A distant hoot of an owl pierced the night, and the wind rustled through the bare trees outside, sending a shiver through the floorboards. I glanced at the window, the world beyond a blur of black and silver. A faint outline of a figure crossed the field, a lone rider on a motorcycle, the engine a low hum that seemed to echo the thrum of my own pulse. Ryder's eyes followed it too, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "That's a Blackfang scout," he muttered, almost to himself. "They're not supposed to be here." I swallowed, the beans dry in my mouth. "Why would they be looking for you?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could filter it. He tightened his grip on the spoon, the muscles in his forearm rippling under his shirt. "Because I'm not supposed to be here," he said, the words heavy with something I couldn't quite place: duty, fear, a history I couldn't see, and because they think a human alpha marriage is a weakness we can exploit. His gaze flicked to the runes, which now glowed a steady amber, as if absorbing the tension between us. I felt the runes pulse, the light shifting with every breath I took, each inhale a whisper of truth, each exhale a concealed fear. I realized I could hear the crackle of the fire and my own heartbeat as one continuous rhythm. "What if we don't let them win?" I whispered, the idea forming in my mind like a fragile bridge. Ryder's hand brushed the edge of the cot, his fingers lingering on the rough pine. "Then we have to stay honest," he replied, his voice low enough that only the runes seemed to hear. The amber glow softened, settling into a warm gold that filled the cabin with a sense of calm I hadn't expected. The night stretched ahead, the cabin's walls holding our secrets, the runes waiting for the next confession. Somewhere outside, the Blackfang Scout's engine faded into the distance, leaving a lingering smell of pine resin and iron that slipped through the cracks of the door, promising that tomorrow would bring more than just a sunrise. The fire crackled lower, throwing amber shadows across the runes that pulsed like a restless heart, and I felt the cabin's breath sink with mine. I reached for the tin of beans, the metal cold against my palm, and the scent of oil rose as I twisted the lid. Ryder was already at the stove, his shoulders hunched, the scar on his left hand catching the flame's light. He turned when the lid popped, eyes flickering to the line of silver on my wrist, then back to the pot as if measuring how much of me I was willing to reveal. "Sit," he said, pushing a cracked wooden chair toward the hearth. The wood smelled of sap and soot, and the chair gave a soft sigh under my weight. I let the bean spoon rest on the table, its metal tingling against the tablecloth that smelled faintly of pine resin and old smoke. My mind raced through the contract clauses I'd skimmed earlier, the lawyer's name Geller scribbled on a scrap of paper I'd tucked in my notebook, and the promise that I could walk away at midnight. Yet the runes flared green each time my thoughts drifted toward the exit, a silent reminder that honesty was the only currency here. "You're quiet," Ryder observed, voice low, the words reverberating against the stone walls. He watched a rune on the far side of the room pulse brighter as I swallowed. "Something on your mind?" I stared at the spoon, the metal now warm from the beans, and felt the silver sigil throb like a pulse. "I'm scared of this whole thing ending up as another line on a resume." My laugh cracked, thin as the bark of the pine outside. He leaned forward, hand resting on the toolbox, fingers brushing a rivet. The scent of iron rose from the metal, mingling with the pine. "You have a habit of putting everything in a spreadsheet," he said, eyes softening. "Even fear." The runes dimmed, a soft amber washing over the wall, and for a heartbeat I could hear my own breath louder than the wind rattling the shutters. I caught the smell of his cologne cedar and something wild when he raised his hand to wipe a droplet of soot from his cheek. His thumb brushed the scar, and a shiver ran up my arm, the kind I'd felt once standing on a subway platform when a stranger's stare lingered too long. "Why did you agree to this?" "Not the contract, I gestured at the circle of stones we'd seen on the map. "The whole deal." His jaw tightened, the faint grin leaving his lips. "Because I can't let Leela stay here alone. The pack expects a leader, and I'd rather die protecting her than rule a throne I never wanted." A sudden howl drifted through the trees, distant yet unmistakable, and the runes flared white, a blinding flash that made my eyes sting. In that sudden light I saw the outline of a folded note stuck under the toolbox, the paper yellowed, a feathered quill pressed against it. I didn't pick it up, but the mystery of its contents settled like a stone in my stomach. Ryder exhaled, the breath fogging the glass of the tiny window. "You've been more than a contract for a few hours," he said, voice raw, the words hanging between us like the lingering scent of rain on dry earth. I felt my hand rise, fingers trembling, and brushed the cool metal of the spoon against his knuckles. The contact sparked a warmth that traveled up my forearm, and the runes softened to a gentle gold. I didn't speak. The sound of the fire, the low thrum of the cabin, and the distant rumble of a Blackfang engine far beyond the trees were enough to fill the space where words would have been. The fire's glow crawled up the rough pine walls, turning the green runes into a restless sea of light. I sat on the low wooden chair, the grain warm beneath my thighs, and let the heat seep into the marrow of my fingers. When I watched Ryder bend over the pot, his shoulders rounding like the back of a wolf ready to surge, I felt a pulse of something that wasn't entirely fear. He turned, the spoon clinking against the metal, and caught my eye. "You still thinking about the press list?" he asked, a half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The question landed between the crackle of the fire and the wind that rattled the shutters, and I found myself nodding without meaning to. "I'm trying to line up a feature on emerging voices for the gala. If I can pair a debut author with a big-name sponsor, I'll have something solid for the board." I swallowed, the taste of pine resin on the back of my throat mixing with the bitterness of the coffee I'd left in my bag. "You ever have to pitch something you don't believe in?" His eyes flicked to the runes on the far wall, where a soft amber pulse dimmed as I spoke. All the time, fixing a leaky roof for a guy who thinks the neighborhood association is a cult isn't exactly my dream project. He laughed, a short bark that seemed to echo off the stone floor. But when it's about keeping someone safe, that feels different. I let the comment hover, the way I usually let a deadline hover over a manuscript until I'm forced to edit. The fire snapped, sending a stray ember onto the pine, and I leaned forward, the scent of smoke pressing into my nostrils. What's a safe project for a guy who can shift into a wolf? He stared into the flame, the amber light catching the scar on his left hand, making it look like a silver slash. It's not the shift that scares me, it's the eyes that follow it. He tightened his grip on the spoon, the muscles in his forearm bulging under his shirt. People expect me to lead. They see the alpha as a throne, not a responsibility. The runes flared a brief green, as if the truth in his words had drawn a fresh line of honesty across the walls. My own breath caught on the edge of my tongue, and I felt the silver sigil on my wrist throb in rhythm with his heartbeat. I thought I could keep everything under control, I said, the words tasting like paper cut. Make a contract, sign it, and walk away when the clock strikes 12. It's cleaner than dealing with feelings. He set the spoon down with deliberate care, the metal ringing against the pot. You can't lock a feeling in a contract. It's a living thing. It moves around you, looks for cracks. He leaned forward, the shadow of his jaw falling across the fire, and reached out, his fingers brushing the cool metal of my notebook. The touch was brief, but the heat that traveled up his hand made the paper rise against my palm. You write stories. You know how a plot can twist when a character refuses to stay in their lane. My eyes drifted to the page where I'd penciled sponsorship outreach, 5/11, 6/2, 6/14. The ink was neat, each bullet a promise I'd made to myself. I traced the letters with the tip of my thumb, feeling the texture of the paper, the faint ridges where the ink had pressed. I've spent 10 years pretending I'm unbreakable. The only thing that ever broke me was the words slipped out before I could catch them, and the runes flared a harsh green, casting the cabin in an unforgiving light. Ryder's shoulders tensed, and for a heartbeat I thought the fire would swallow us both. Then his voice softened, low enough that it seemed to vibrate against the stone rather than travel through the air. Your mother left when you were 12, didn't she? You told me that once before the broker showed up. I stared at him, the question landing like a stone in a quiet pond. The memory surged up unbidden, the humming of the fridge in my childhood apartment, the sharp clang of the front door closing, the echo of my mother's footsteps fading down the hallway. She just walked out, took the car, the dog, the summer. I was left with a stack of unpaid bills and a house that smelled like old carpet. My cheeks burned, but I kept my voice steady. That's why I build walls. If I can control everything on paper, I won't have to worry about who walks out. He watched me, his eyes narrowing not with judgment but with something that felt almost like recognition. You're not the only one who's been abandoned, he said. My sister Leela, she's 6, she thinks the world is a garden of endless pine cones. The pack thinks I'm the one who should take the throne, but I'd rather be the one who catches her when she falls. He glanced toward the cot, where the thin blanket lay folded neat as a promise. She looks up at the moon and asks why the night is so dark. I tell her it's because the stars are too shy to shine all at once. It's a lie, but it's a lie that keeps her safe. The runes dimmed to a soft gold, the amber light pooling around us like a quiet tide. I felt a shift inside, the way a page turns when you finally set the pen down. You're protecting her the same way I'm protecting my career, I murmured, more to the fire than to him. Both of us are holding something fragile. He lifted his hand, the scar catching the firelight, and placed his palm lightly on the edge of the cot. We keep pretending we're the only ones who can fix things, but maybe we need to let someone else do the fixing sometimes. He tapped the wood, and the sound resonated through the cabin, a low thud that seemed to echo the beat of my heart. We fell into a silence that wasn't empty. Outside, the wind slipped between the bare branches, a whisper that sounded like someone pulling a thread. Inside, the scent of pine mixed with the metallic tang of the fire, and I could hear the faint rustle of paper as Ryder reached for the folded note hidden under the toolbox. He unfolded it slowly, the edges crinkling like old leaves. His eyes flickered over the ink, and a crease formed between his brows. "What is it?" I asked, curiosity pricking at the back of my throat. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the note on the table, the paper catching a gust of wind that slipped through the cracked window and fluttered like a moth. "A warning," he said finally, his voice low. "Someone warned the pack about a human Alpha Covenant that could be used to destabilize us. It mentioned a Blackfang informant embedded in a nearby town, gathering intel." He traced a line with his finger, the ink smudging slightly under his touch. "The name Mara. I've never heard it before, but the tone felt familiar." The runes flickered, a soft pulse of green, as if the truth of the warning tugged at the ancient magic. I leaned forward, the scent of the note's paper reminding me of old books in the publishing house, of drafts that fluttered under fluorescent lights. "Do you think she's looking for you, for the marriage?" He tightened his grip on the note, the scar catching the light as his knuckles whitened. "If she finds the contract, she could force us to expose the pack. Or," he stopped, the words hanging like a blade over the fire, "or she could use it to turn the pack against me, make me look like a traitor." His jaw clenched, and the amber runes dimmed a fraction as a shadow passed across his face. I swallowed, feeling the pressure of the sigil on my wrist shift, as if it sensed the danger in his words. "We should keep that note hidden. If the Blackfangs get a look at it, they'll know we're planning something." I reached across the table, my fingers brushing his. The contact was electric, a static charge that made my skin prickle. "We'll need a plan." He nodded, the scar catching a final flash of fire before the light steadied. "First, we secure the cabin. The runes will help us. They can't lie. If we're honest about the layout, they'll show us any weak points." He stood, his movements fluid, and walked to the far wall, tracing a finger along the ancient symbols. The runes pulsed brighter, a cascade of green that illuminated a faint outline of a hidden compartment behind a stack of firewood. I followed, my own eyes scanning the wood for any irregularities. My mind raced with the image of a hidden drawer, of secrets sealed away centuries ago. The scent of aged timber rose as I nudged a log aside, and a narrow opening yawned, revealing a shallow box lined with faded vellum. Inside lay a small, brass key glinting in the firelight. Its surface was etched with a symbol I recognized from the broker's seal, an interlocking circle of wolves and books. "What does it open?" I whispered, the question slipping out before I could weigh its importance. Ryder lifted the key, his thumb brushing the etched symbol, and a faint, almost imperceptible howl seemed to vibrate through the cabin walls. "Probably the stone circle's offset lock," he said. "They built a secondary seal for emergencies. If we can access it, we might have a way to end this without the Blackfangs forcing us into a fight." The runes flared a bright white, filling the cabin with a sudden brilliance that made us both shield our eyes. When the light receded, a soft amber remained, and the air felt thinner, as if the magic itself had taken a breath. I felt the weight of the key in my hand, its cool metal grounding me to the present in a way my notebook never could. "We should rest now," Ryder suggested, his voice softer, the edge of command softened by fatigue. "We need clear heads for tomorrow." I sank back into the chair, the wood creaking under my weight, and let the fire's warmth seep into my bones. The bean spoon lay forgotten on the table, a small relic of the evening's simplicity. My thoughts drifted to the contract, to the silver line that seemed to pulse against my skin every time I thought about the upcoming sunrise. I realized I'd stopped counting the minutes, absorbed instead in the rhythm of the cabin, the subtle dance of our bodies side by side. Ryder settled onto the opposite cot, his back against the wall, shoulders relaxed enough to suggest safety but still taut like a coiled spring. He pulled the thin blanket over his shoulders, the rough fibers brushing his skin. I watched the way his breath fogged the cold glass of the window, each exhale a ghost of breath that dissipated with the hiss of wind outside. "Did you ever think you'd be sleeping in a pine cabin with a werewolf?" I asked, half joking, half curious, the question slipping out as the fire's glow softened. He chuckled, a low rumble that sounded like distant thunder. "Honestly, I thought I'd be back in the city, fixing a busted pipe in an upscale loft, then never looking back." He paused, eyes narrowing as they tracked a distant owl's hoot. "But now I'm learning that a cabin can be a sanctuary and a cage." The runes dimmed to a gentle amber, painting his face in soft light. "Sanctuary for whom?" I asked, the question a thread tugging at the edge of my mind. His gaze lingered on the key in my palm for a moment, then shifted to the ceiling where a single antler hung, a relic of a past hunt. "For the ones who need it most," he said. "For Leela, for the pack, for anyone who's willing to stay honest long enough for the magic to listen." I felt a knot in my throat loosen, the way a tight stitch untangles when you pull gently. The secret of my mother's departure, the fear that had driven me to the contract, all of it seemed to settle into something more manageable, like a story that finally found its narrative arc. The fire crackled, sending a flurry of sparks up to the rafters, and the cabin seemed to breathe with us, the walls pulsing in tandem with our thoughts. A sudden thump rattled the door, the sound of a branch striking the wooden frame. I turned, my heart stuttering a beat, and saw a shadow dart across the doorway, a silhouette that lingered for a heartbeat before disappearing into the night. I frowned, the scent of pine sharpening in my nostrils, and the runes flared a soft green, as if acknowledging the intrusion. Ryder's hand moved instinctively to the scar on his left palm, the flesh tightening around the old wound. "Who's there?" he called, voice low, the words slicing through the quiet like a blade. No answer came, only the howl of wind through the trees. The fire sputtered, throwing a brief darkness over the room before the flames steadied. I stood, my boots crunching on the pine floorboards, and moved toward the doorway, the cold air biting at my cheeks. The night beyond was a blackened canvas, the moon a thin crescent barely piercing the clouds. A faint glow from the stone circle lay far in the distance, a promise of the ceremony waiting for sunrise. I peered out, the forest a maze of twisted trunks and damp moss. The wind carried a metallic tang, the smell of blood and oil mingling with the pine. "Ryder," I whispered, "someone's out there. They could be Blackfang scouts, or someone else." He stepped in front of me, his silhouette a dark barrier against the weak moonlight. "Stay inside," he warned, but his eyes flicked to the hidden compartment where the key lay. "If it's them, we need a plan. If it's not, we need to be ready for anything." I hesitated, the internal tug of my fear of abandonment pulling at me, whispering that I should retreat, that I should protect the fragile structure I'd built around myself. Yet I felt another voice, one that had begun to trust, that wanted to prove she could stay, that could be the one to hold the line for someone else. The runes pulsed a steady amber, a silent encouragement. "Fine," I said, the word solid as a footstep, "but make sure the door's locked. I'm not sleeping with a window open." Ryder gave a short nod, his fingers moving to the latch. The metal click resonated, a small but decisive sound that felt like a promise. He stepped back, his posture relaxed enough to suggest he wasn't a threat, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the darkness beyond the cabin's thin walls. We returned to our spots, me to the chair, him to the cot, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. The fire crackled lower, the embers turning to a soft, orange haze. I opened my notebook, flipping to a fresh page, the paper smooth under my fingertips. The title read, Chapter 6: Unexpected Alliances. I hadn't written the words yet, but the idea of a new chapter formed in my mind, one where the protagonist learns to lean on an unlikely companion. Ryder glanced over, his own gaze lingering on the runes that now glimmered with a quiet gold. "You ever write about a wolf?" he asked, a faint smile playing on his lips. I smirked, the edge of my sarcasm sharpening like a pen tip. Only if it's a metaphor for the corporate ladder. The words landed and the runes dimmed just a shade, as if acknowledging the humor hidden in truth. He chuckled, the sound resonating in the small space. I think we're both climbing ladders we never wanted to see the top of. The fire popped, sending a small ember dancing across the floor before it settled into the ash. I inhaled the scent of burning wood, the smoke curling into my lungs like an old friend. My mind floated to the upcoming sunrise, to the stone circle, to the ancient glyphs that would decide our fate. The secret note about Mara lingered at the back of my thoughts. Who was she? And why did her name feel like a warning spoken in a childhood nightmare? I glanced at Ryder, seeing the way his shoulders eased just enough to reveal the faint scar beneath his shirt, a reminder of battles fought both visible and hidden. I wondered what other scars he kept hidden, what memories he kept locked away like the key in my pocket. The thought made my own secret feel less solitary, as if our hidden wounds were threads in a larger tapestry. A sudden crack of a branch against the cabin's eaves made both of us start. For a moment, the world narrowed to the rhythm of our breathing, the crackling fire, and the faint pulse of the runes. Then, without a word, Ryder rose, his boots silent on the pine, and moved to the window. He pulled the curtain aside, the thin fabric fluttering like a moth's wing, and peered into the night. The forest was a black sea, the moon a distant lantern. A faint rustle moved through the trees, too deliberate to be merely wind. Ryder's eyes narrowed, his jaw set, and he turned back to me, his expression a mix of resolve and caution. "They're testing us," he said, voice low. "If they want to break the contract, they'll try to break the trust it's built on." I swallowed, the weight of my own distrust tugging at me. "You think they'll try to break us apart?" I asked, the question a trembling leaf in a storm. He stepped closer, the heat from his body mingling with the fire's glow. "They already have. The scout's presence, the note about Mara, this is all a pressure cooker. They want us to panic, to lie, to turn the runes against each other." He placed a hand on the back of my chair, his fingers brushing the wood. The contact was brief, but it sent a shiver down my spine, a reminder that proximity could turn fear into something else, maybe even something like hope. The runes softened to a gentle amber, the light bathing the cabin in a warm, almost intimate glow. I felt a tremor of something like trust flicker through me, a fragile flame that refused to be snuffed out. "Then let's stay honest," I said, the words flowing from my mouth with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. "Even if it hurts." Ryder's smile deepened, the scar catching the firelight one last time. "Even then, the magic will keep us in check." He reached for the key in my hand, the brass cool against his palm. "And if we need to, we'll use it together." The key's weight settled between us, a tangible promise that we were no longer two strangers sharing a contract, but two people bound by a shared secret, a mutual respect, and a growing desire to protect each other. The fire crackled louder, as if applauding our silent pact, while the runes glowed a steady gold, marking the moment we chose honesty over fear. Outside, the wind howled a mournful tune, the forest whispering of hidden threats and unseen eyes. Inside, the cabin breathed with us, the ancient symbols pulsing in time with our heartbeats, a reminder that the night would stretch on, that challenges would surface, and that the path ahead was still shrouded in mystery. Yet, for the first time since the contract was sealed, I felt a certainty that didn't come from a legal document. It came from the simple, stubborn belief that we could face whatever came together, as partners, as allies, as something more. The ember's glow faded into a soft, steady ember, and the night deepened. I leaned back, eyes tracing the amber patterns on the walls, and allowed the silence to settle, waiting for the dawn that would test everything we had built in these few hours. The promise of sunrise lingered on the horizon, a silent countdown to a future still unwritten. The wind slammed the shutters again, rattling the pine like a nervous drum, and I slipped the notebook into the coat pocket, feeling the cold metal of the brass key brush against the seam. Ryder stood by the stove, his shoulders hunched over the pot, the scar on his left hand catching the flicker of orange as the flame licked the iron. He turned at the sound of the door creak, eyes narrowed, and for a heartbeat the runes on the far wall pulsed a harsh green, as if the wood itself sensed the intrusion. A figure lingered in the doorway, cloaked in a charcoal coat that soaked up the firelight. The person's breath was a thin plume of vapor, scented with pine resin and something metallic blood. The silhouette raised a gloved hand, exposing the silver insignia etched into the cuff, a twisted wolf head wrapped around a quill. My stomach contracted. The broker's seal had that exact pattern. Thought you could hide a contract in a cabin? The voice rasped, low enough to merge with the wind outside. Ryder's grip tightened around the pot handle, knuckles whitening. He stepped forward, the floorboard sighing under his weight, and whispered, "We don't have to." I pressed the back of my hand to the cold window, feeling the glass shiver under the night's chill, and watched the stranger's eyes flick toward the hidden compartment we'd uncovered earlier. A faint rustle rose from the pine stack, and a second, smaller shadow slipped between the trees, disappearing into darkness. The runes dimmed to a soft amber, then flared a thin line of green as my mind darted back to the folded note about Mara. Was the scout's name a trap, or a warning about someone we'd never met? My mouth opened, but the words tangled with the taste of iron on my tongue. "You're not," I began, the pen in my pocket tapping against the fabric, a reminder of deadlines I'd left behind. Ryder cut in, voice low, "If you want the sigil, you'll have to give it up." His hand brushed the key in my palm, the metal cold as a grave. The stranger laughed, a dry crack that sounded like broken twigs, and stepped aside, revealing a battered leather satchel piled with old contracts, each stamped with the same wolf quill seal. I felt the runes flare bright white, the cabin blinding for a breath, then settling into an uneasy gold. The fire sputtered, casting long shadows that licked the walls like wary wolves. Behind the stranger, the faint outline of a horse's head appeared on the far side of the stone circle, half hidden by fog, as if someone had already begun to circle the ritual site. A sudden pressure built in my chest, a familiar knot tightening. My mother's sudden departure, the day the apartment lights went out, and I was left holding only the silence. My fingers curled around the key, the weight of it suddenly heavier than the brass itself. Ryder's gaze locked onto mine, the scar catching the firelight one last time. "We either fight together or we both walk out." The words hung in the smoky air, and the runes hummed a low, steady pulse, as if waiting for a decision. I could hear the distant howl of a wolf echoing across the trees, a sound that felt both warning and invitation. The night had settled into a thin shawl of amber light when I finally slipped the key from my palm and tucked it into the inner seam of my coat, feeling the cool metal press against the wool like a quiet promise. The runes on the far wall pulsed a steady gold, as if acknowledging the decision I'd just made, but the glow did not erase the tremor that still lingered in my fingertips. I stared at the fire, its orange tongues licking the stone floor, and tried to picture the contract's silver line as something more than a legal shackle, a line that could be redrawn, a boundary we could choose to keep or let go. Ryder stood opposite me, his back against the rough pine, the scar on his left hand catching the firelight in a thin crescent. He was holding the brass key with both palms, turning it slowly as if feeling for a hidden groove. "You're still thinking about the meeting in Ashbourne," he said, his voice low enough that only the wind outside could hear. The words folded into the crackle of the hearth, and I felt the runes flare a brief green as my mind drifted back to the stone circle, those ancient stones that would soon demand a declaration of truth from us both. I lifted my notebook, the pages still warm from the heat of the fire, and flipped to a fresh sheet. The heading I'd written earlier, Chapter 7, Redemption, stared back at me, the ink still wet. I didn't write the words yet. Instead, I let the silence sit between us, heavy with the scent of pine resin and the faint metallic tang that seemed to rise from the very air whenever the sigil on my wrist throbbed. The moment stretched, and I could hear the distant howl of a wolf, a low mournful note that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper than the forest, perhaps from the pack itself or from the part of me that still feared abandonment. "Do you ever wonder if we're just playing into someone else's story?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could filter it. My eyes flicked to the locked compartment we'd uncovered earlier, the brass key still half visible in my coat. All this, the runes, the sigil, the note about Mara, it feels like pieces of a puzzle someone else has already solved. Ryder's shoulders relaxed just enough to let a faint sigh escape his chest. He set the key down on the table, the metal clink echoing softly. "Probably," he said, turning his head to stare at the stone circle beyond the window, the moon a thin slice of silver threading through the clouds. "But the fact that we're here, that we chose to stay, means we're writing our own line. The pack expects me to lead. The Blackfangs expect me to break. I've been a pawn for so long I stopped noticing the board." I felt the runes pulse a soft amber, a gentle reminder that honesty was still the only fire that could light them. "I've been a pawn too," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Every deadline, every promotion, each one a move in a game I never wanted to play. I signed that contract because I thought I could control the outcome, that I could walk away when the clock struck 12. I was wrong. I can't make a contract out of love, but I can make a choice." He stepped closer, the scent of cedar and something wild mingling with the smoke from the fire. His hand found the edge of my notebook, the paper warm under his fingertips, and for a heartbeat I felt the world narrow to the contact of skin on paper. "What are you choosing, Eliza?" he asked, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "To stay because you're scared I'll leave, or because you see something worth protecting?" The runes flared a pale green as his question brushed the surface of my fear. My mind snapped back to the night my mother walked out, the empty hallway that smelled of stale coffee and cold rain, the way my mother's key had turned in the lock and never come back. I swallowed, feeling the tight knot in my throat loosen just enough to let a breath out. "Because I'm tired of building walls that only keep people out," I said, the words steadying like a tide. "Because I realized that the walls are also the cages I put myself in. If I'm going to be honest with the runes, I have to be honest with myself." He nodded, the scar on his hand catching the firelight once more. "Then we both have to be willing to break more than just a contract. The pack will see this as betrayal, the Blackfangs will see it as a threat. Leela will need me, and you." He hesitated, his eyes flickering to my wrist where the silver sigil glimmered faintly. "You'll need something beyond a promotion. You've always said you wanted to make a difference, not just climb a ladder. Maybe we can find a way to use the key to help both worlds." I glanced at the hidden compartment, the brass key now half visible, and felt a surge of something hope. Maybe that had nothing to do with the contract and everything to do with the fact that we were sitting together, two strangers bound by magic, now choosing to stay. What if we use the key to open the stone circle's secondary seal and rewrite the terms? I suggested, the idea forming like a breadcrumb trail in my mind. We could negotiate with the council, make the marriage a true partnership instead of a forced bond. It would be risky, but it would give us leverage. Ryder's jaw tightened, the muscles around his mouth working as if he were shifting weight he didn't want to drop. "The council isn't going to listen to a human editor and a runaway alpha," he muttered, eyes scanning the walls where the runes pulsed with a soft gold. "But they'll listen to blood. If we can prove that the sigil can be reactivated only by mutual consent, maybe they'll see it as an alliance rather than a weakness." A sudden crack of a branch against the shutters made us both flinch. The wind rattled the pine like an impatient child, and the runes on the far wall flared a harsh green, a reminder that deception was still lurking in the room. I felt the faint hum of the note we'd found earlier, the scrawled warning about Mara, and a chill ran down my spine. "We still don't know who Mara is," I said, the question hanging in the smoky air. "If she's more than a name, she could have a hand in this whole thing. The Blackfangs might be a front for something bigger." Ryder's eyes darkened, and for a moment his throat seemed to tighten. He reached for the brass key, his fingers brushing the worn edges, and the runes dimmed to a gentle amber as if acknowledging the weight of the unknown. "I've heard whispers," he admitted, his voice barely above the fire. "A faction within the pack that wants to destabilize the council by using human alpha marriages as leverage. Mara could be a broker, a spy, or a rival pack's envoy. Whatever she is, she's already in motion." I felt a prickle at the base of my neck, the same prickle that had shown up every time I'd thought about my mother's departure. "And the broker who sold us this contract?" I asked, the word broker tasting like iron. "He left a seal on the documents, the wolf quill we saw on the stranger's cuff. He could be a pawn of Mara, or he could be trying to protect us. Either way, I need to know who he is before we walk into the stone circle with half the story." The fire popped, sending a bright ember spiraling up to the rafters, and for a second the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Ryder leaned forward, the heat of his breath fogging the glass of the tiny window. "There's a ledger in the cabin," he said, glancing toward the wooden chest where the note and key had been hidden. "If we can find a record of the contracts the broker has made, we might see a pattern. Maybe there's a clause we missed, a loophole that lets us negotiate without the council's approval." My mind raced, the ink on the fresh page of my notebook mirroring the rush of thoughts. "We could copy the ledger, send it to someone I trust at Blackthorn," I offered, the idea sparking a glimmer of excitement. "An editor's network could trace the broker's connections, maybe even expose Mara's hand. It would be risky. Exposing a supernatural contract to a corporate board could ruin me, but it might also give us an angle the pack can't ignore." Ryder's shoulders relaxed just enough to let a faint smile play at the corners of his mouth. "You always think 3 moves ahead," he said, admiration threading through his words like a subtle chord. "I've been stuck in the present, reacting to every threat. Watching you plot feels new, like I'm learning to be a part of a world that isn't just wood and wolf." The runes glowed a soft gold, the amber light spilling over his scar as if it were a badge of honor. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, not from the fire, but from the realization that his perception of me had shifted from a contract partner to something more complex. "Maybe we both need to start planning ahead," I replied, the edge of my sarcasm softened by genuine curiosity. "If we're going to survive this, we need each other's strengths. Your knowledge of the pack, my access to information. Together we might be able to rewrite the rules." He pushed his chair back, the wood groaning, and stood, stretching his arms above his head, the motion sending a faint crackle through the cabin's timber. "Then let's make a pact, not just a marriage. We'll keep the key, we'll keep the ledger, and we'll keep each other honest. The runes will force us to speak the truth. We'll force each other to act on it." I rose as well, the coat brushing against my boots, the leather soles squeaking softly on the pine floor. My hand brushed the edge of the notebook, the paper soft under my fingertips, and I felt the runes pulse a faint green, as if they were listening for deception. "All right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We'll split the work. I'll get the ledger digitized and send it to a trusted contact at Blackthorn. You'll find a way to access the council's hearing chamber, maybe use the secondary seal to propose a new binding." He nodded, the scar catching a final flash of flame as he turned to the hidden compartment. He lifted the pine plank, the wood giving way with a sigh, and revealed the shallow box that held the brass key. He slipped the key into his coat pocket, the metal cool against his skin. "And I'll talk to the pack's elder," he said, eyes narrowing as if he could already hear the council's murmurs. "If they see that we're united, if they see the runes dim only when we both speak truth, they might reconsider the old laws. It won't be easy, but it's a start." The runes on the far wall dimmed to an amber glow, then brightened to a gentle gold as we each took a step toward the door, the night outside pressing against the shutters like a patient audience. I paused, my hand hovering over the latch, and felt the weight of the sigil on my wrist, a thin line of silver that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. "One more thing," I said, the words lingering in the air. "We shouldn't trust anyone completely, not even each other. The runes will expose lies, but we still have to choose to be honest. Ryder's gaze met mine, his wolf-gray eyes reflecting the fire's dance. Then we'll keep each other accountable, he replied, his tone firm, the scar on his hand catching the firelight once more. We'll check in every night, share what we've learned, and if the runes ever flare green, we'll know we've slipped. A distant howl rose from beyond the tree line, a sound that seemed both warning and invitation. It curled through the cabin, threading through the pine and the smoke, and the runes glowed a soft, steady amber as if acknowledging the pact we'd just forged. I felt a shiver run down my spine, not from cold but from the realization that something deeper than forced proximity was taking root, a partnership built on mutual risk, on shared secrets, on the willingness to expose our vulnerabilities to a magic that would not tolerate pretenses. We stepped out into the night, the door swinging shut behind us with a soft thud that resonated through the floorboards. The wind slammed the shutters again, rattling them like a drumbeat, and the scent of pine mingled with the metallic tang of rain still fresh on the ground. The road ahead was a thin ribbon of gravel winding through the forest, the stone circle a distant silhouette against the horizon, its ancient glyphs faintly glowing in the pre-dawn mist. I hoisted my coat tighter, the fabric rustling against my shoulder, and glanced at Ryder, who carried his toolbox as if it were a sacred relic. The scar on his hand was now hidden, but the faint glow of the runes seemed to linger on his skin, a reminder that the magic was still watching. "We'll need to get to the council before sunrise," he said, his voice low, the words already setting the rhythm of our steps. I nodded, feeling the weight of the notebook inside my coat pocket, the pages fluttering with the possibility of new chapters. "And we'll have to be ready for whatever Mara throws at us," I added, the name lingering on my tongue like a bitter aftertaste. He glanced back toward the cabin, his eyes catching a flash of light from a cracked window. Something moved inside, a shadow that slipped across the wall and vanished. The runes dimmed to a muted amber, then pulsed a brief, sharp green as if the cabin itself were warning us. "Someone's still here," Ryder murmured, the word barely audible over the rustling leaves. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, the same knot that had formed every time I'd been left alone as a child, but this time I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my fingers brush the edge of the notebook, the paper cool against my skin, and I let the uncertainty settle like a stone in my gut. "We'll deal with it when we get there," I said, the resolve in my voice steadier than I felt. "For now, we focus on staying honest, on keeping the runes dim for a change." Ryder gave a short, low chuckle that sounded like a wolf's bark softened by night. "Honesty isn't exactly our specialty," he said, but the hint of a smile softened his tone. "But we'll try." We walked side by side, the path narrowing between ancient oaks that seemed to lean in, their branches scraping the sky like the fingers of old guardians. The air grew colder, each breath forming a mist in front of us, the scent of wet earth rising with every step. My coat rustled, the fabric catching on the pine needles that brushed against my legs, and I felt the silver sigil on my wrist throb faintly, a pulse that matched the rhythm of the forest. As we approached the clearing where the stone circle waited, a faint glimmer caught my eye, a thin, metallic thread hanging from a low branch, swaying slightly in the breeze. It looked like a piece of rope, but the metal glint suggested it might be a piece of the broker's chain, the one we'd never seen up close. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal, and the runes in the cabin flared a soft green, as if reacting to the secret I'd uncovered. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, an echo of the hidden ledger, the note about Mara, the unknown hands that had set this whole game in motion. Ryder stopped beside me, his eyes narrowing as he followed my gaze. "What is that?" he asked, the curiosity in his voice barely masking a note of caution. I pulled the thread free, the metal cool and heavier than it looked, and examined it in the low light of dawn beginning to bleed through the trees. It bore a faint engraving, a tiny wolf's head intertwined with a feathered quill, the same symbol we'd seen on the broker's cuff and on the satchel of the intruder at the cabin. My skin prickled. The runes in the cabin had hinted at a larger network, and this was a tangible fragment of it. The broker's seal, I whispered, the words tasting like a secret finally spoken. Someone left it here, maybe as a marker, or a warning. Ryder's jaw tightened, and his hand moved instinctively to the scar on his wrist, the muscles there tensing as if bracing for a blow. If Mara's involved, this could be a breadcrumb she wants us to find, he said, his tone mixing suspicion with an undercurrent of dread. She might be leading us into a trap, or she might be showing us a way out. Either way, we can't ignore it. The runes in the cabin had been a silent observer, reacting to each confession, each lie, each half-truth. Now, the forest seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, the stones in the circle humming faintly as if waiting for our arrival. I slipped the metal fragment into my pocket, the weight of it grounding me even as the uncertainty swirled around us like the fog that began to settle over the clearing. We reached the stone circle just as the first pale light of sunrise began to gild the ancient glyphs etched into the standing stones. The runes we'd seen inside the cabin were mirrored here, larger and older, their lines glowing a soft amber that seemed to breathe with the day's first breath. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp moss and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Ryder stepped forward, his hand hovering over the central stone where the sigil on my wrist would soon be bound to the earth. We need to make this official, he said, his voice reverberating against the stones. If we want the council to see us as partners, we have to use the secondary seal the key opens, and we have to do it together, one hand each. I looked at the key in my pocket, the brass glinting in the early light, and felt the weight of the decision settle like a stone in my hand. The runes on the stones flickered, a bright green pulse as if testing our resolve. We do it, I said, the certainty in my voice a thin veneer over the fear that threatened to break through. But we also need to protect Leela, the council, and the people we care about. This isn't just about us. Ryder's eyes softened, the scar catching a stray beam of sunlight, turning it into a thin line of light that seemed to trace his past wounds. I won't let them use my sister as a pawn, he promised, his voice low and fierce. And I won't let you become a casualty of their politics. We'll fight on our terms. The runes on the surrounding stones dimmed to a gentle amber, then flared a bright white as the key slipped into the carved notch of the central stone. A low hum rose from the earth, vibrating through the soles of our boots, through the fabric of my coat, through the scar on Ryder's hand. The silver sigil on my wrist glowed brighter, the line of magic pulsing in tandem with the key's turn, as if the two of us were now linked not just by a contract but by shared intention. I felt a surge of heat rush through my veins, an almost electric sensation that made the runes on the cabin's walls flash in my mind: green when we lied, amber when we spoke truth, gold when we chose honesty together. The stone circle's glyphs pulsed a steady gold, a promise that the magic would hold if we honored it. Now, Ryder said, his voice steady, we speak the truth we've been hiding. I took a breath, the cold air filling my lungs with the scent of pine and stone, and let the words flow. I signed the contract because I feared abandonment. I thought a paper marriage would protect me from losing control, but it only deepened the wound I tried to hide. My voice trembled, then steadied as the runes shifted to a calm amber. I want to build something real, not just a shield. Ryder's eyes flickered, the scar on his hand catching the light as he spoke. I ran from the pack because I feared losing myself, because I thought love would chain me to a destiny I didn't choose. I signed because I thought I could protect Leela by disappearing, but I realized I was only putting her in danger by staying hidden. The runes flared a soft green, then softened as his confession settled. The stone's surface glowed brighter, the secondary seal clicking into place, and a wave of warm light washed over us. the amber radiance encompassing the clearing. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the runes on the cabin humming faintly in the distance, the Blackwing Scout's silhouettes fading into the mist beyond the tree line, and the broker's seal on the metal fragment in my pocket feeling like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. I felt Ryder's hand find mine, his grip firm but gentle, the scar brushing my skin like a reminder of everything he'd endured. The rune's amber light wrapped around us, a silent witness to our pact. We stood there, two people bound by magic, by choice, by the willingness to face the darkness together, even as the unknown loomed ahead. A sudden rustle in the bushes made both of us turn, eyes scanning the edge of the circle. A figure stepped forward, cloaked in the same charcoal coat we'd seen in the coffee shop, the silver wolf quill insignia glinting on the cuff. The person's face remained hidden, but the posture was familiar, confident, predatory, aware of every movement. He lifted a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture that seemed almost conciliatory. "You've made your choice," the voice whispered, low and resonant, "but the game isn't over." The words hung in the crisp morning air, the runes on the stones flickering a warning green, as if the magic sensed a new lie ready to surface. Ryder's jaw tightened, the scar pulsing with an uneasy light, while I felt the silver sigil on my wrist throb a rapid beat. The metal fragment in my pocket seemed to warm, as if acknowledging the new player's arrival. We stood, hands still clasped, the sunrise painting the forest in gold, the runes a silent chorus waiting for the next truth to be spoken. The night pressed against the cabin's cracked windows like a hand that wouldn't let go, and the fire sputtered low, its orange fingers curling around the stone hearth. I stared at the silver sigil pulsing faintly on my wrist, each throb a reminder that the contract still clung to me, even if the rune-lit walls seemed to settle into a reluctant amber. Ryder stood across from me, the scar on his left hand catching the last ember's glow, a thin crescent of light that reminded me of the wound he never spoke of. "Do you think we can really make the council see this as a partnership?" I asked, the words tasting like ash. My fingers hovered over the notebook tucked inside my coat, the pages still warm from the ink I'd barely managed to dry earlier. The scent of pine resin rose from the floorboards, mixing with the faint metallic tang of the sigil. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, a familiar knot that always tightened when I tried to trust someone with more than a deadline. Ryder's jaw tightened, the muscles around his mouth working like a hinge. "If the key works, it will seal the secondary seal and give us leverage." He turned his gaze to the stone circle beyond the window, where the first hints of dawn were stealing gray from the trees. "But the black fangs won't just fade away because we whisper truth to a set of ancient stones." A gust slammed the shutters, rattling the pine like nervous fingers. The runes on the far wall flared a harsh green, an instant warning that a lie or perhaps a fear was about to spew out. I swallowed, feeling the dry scrape of my throat, and let a truth tumble out before I could catch it. "I'm scared, Ryder. I signed this contract because I thought a paper marriage could keep me from having to be vulnerable. I thought if I could control the terms, I could keep people from walking out." His eyes flickered, the scar catching a stray spark. "You've always been the one who drafts the perfect clause, Eliza." He stepped closer, the creak of his boots on the pine sharp as a probe. "You built walls out of deadlines, but you're still afraid they'll collapse when someone you love steps in." The fire crackled, sending a sudden puff of smoke up my nose, and I inhaled, the bitter sting of it grounding me for a moment. "What about you?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could filter it. "You keep saying you don't want a pack, that leadership would shackle you. Yet you stay here, you're still fixing things, you're still protecting." My voice lowered, the words echoing against the wood. "Are you just running from the same thing?" His shoulders hunched, the scar on his hand flexing. "I thought I could be the one who never needed anyone. I thought I could disappear into the woods and the pack would die without me, and Leela would survive." He glanced toward the corner where the hidden compartment lay, the brass key glinting in the low light. "But every night I hear her whisper to the moon, and every time I hear her, I feel the weight of every decision I make. If I'm not there, who will catch her when she falls? A sudden rustle from the doorway made both of us spin. The charcoal coat we'd seen in the coffee shop entered the cabin, the man's boots leaving dark prints on the pine floor. The silver wolf quill insignia on his cuff caught the firelight, a cold glint that seemed to slice through the amber haze. He held a leather satchel open, its contents spilling onto the floor. Several vellum sheets, each stamped with the same sigil that marked my wrist, and a leather-bound book whose cover bore the Blackfang crest. Thought you could hide a covenant in a pine cabin, the man said, his voice low and rasped, but the magic sees through walls. He lifted a sheet, his finger tracing the silver line with a practiced precision. I'm here to collect what's owed. The pack will have its due, and you'll have yours. Ryder's hand tightened around the hilt of the knife he kept hidden in his boot. You can't. Don't, the stranger cut, his eyes sliding over me. You've already signed, Alpha. The sigil binds you both until the next full moon, unless the secondary seal is activated with both parties' consent. I can dissolve it for a price, or I can leave you to the pack's whim. My heart hammered against my ribs, the silver sigil flaring a brighter green, as if the runes themselves were warning me. I felt the weight of my notebook shift, the pages fluttering like a bird trapped in a storm. What do you want? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt, the words slipping out between the crackle of fire and the distant howl that began to rise from the woods. The man smiled, a thin line that didn't reach his eyes. Information. He lifted the leather-bound book, the Blackfang crest embossed in dark red. Your broker, he's been feeding both sides. He sold you a contract he never intended to keep. He's using you to force the Alpha's hand, and he's keeping Leela as leverage. He dropped the book onto the floor, the thud echoing like a promise broken. Ryder lunged, the knife flashing, but the man was faster. He stepped back, the satchel clattering, and the contents spilled maps of the stone circle, a list of names, and a folded parchment with a single word, Mara. The metal fragment I'd found earlier clinked against the vellum, catching a glint of morning light. Who's Mara? I demanded, the question snapping from my throat. The runes on the walls flared a fierce green, the glow bathing the cabin in an unforgiving light. The stranger's eyes narrowed. A name that means the hunter. She isn't here yet, but she moves pieces like a chess master. She knows about the covenant, about the key, about the fact that you two are the only ones who can stop her. He tossed the parchment toward me. It landed on the floor, the ink still wet, spelling out a schedule of meetings, an appointment with a council elder that I had not yet noticed on the ledger. Ryder took a step back, his breath ragged, the scent of pine and blood mingling. You've been lying to me, Eliza, he whispered, the scar on his hand catching a stray ember. All those nights you claimed you were just editing drafts. You've been feeding this. The runes flared a blinding white, the cabin's walls trembling as if the ancient magic itself recoiled. My mind snapped to the notebook, the pages I'd filled with gala plans, the budget sheets, the emails. All of it my career, my promotion. The promise that a contract could be a safety net was now a flimsy piece of paper in the hands of a man who wore a wolf's seal on his cuff. I didn't know, I said, the words barely audible over the rising wind outside. I thought the broker was just a service. I didn't realize the stakes. His eyes hardened, the scar now a vivid slash of light. You've built your life on control, on the illusion that a contract can protect you from abandonment. You signed a paper to keep someone from walking away, yet you're the one who's walking away now, walking into a trap you never saw. The stranger's hand hovered over the brass key on the floor, his fingers brushing against it lightly. You have a choice, he said, the tone almost gentle. Give me the key, and I'll release you both. The contract will dissolve at sunrise, and you'll walk back to Manhattan with your promotion intact, your reputation salvaged. He gestured to the map of the stone circle. Or you can keep the key, try to bind the seal, and risk the Blackfangs, the pack, and whatever Mara has waiting. Ryder's shoulders slumped, the weight of his failures settling like a stone on his back. He glanced at Leela's photograph tucked into the pocket of his toolbox, a small, smiling face framed by wildflowers. "I can't let her be a pawn," he said, voice cracking. "If we give that key up, the pack will think I'm weak. They'll take Leela, or they'll force me to lead. I can't let that happen." The fire sputtered, sending the spray of ash across the floor, and I felt the silver line on my wrist pulse like a heartbeat in tandem with Ryder's ragged breathing. My mind raced: my promotion, the gala, the contract, the fact that I'd been counting on a paper marriage to keep my mother's abandonment at bay, now feeling like a betrayal of everything I'd built. I could hear the distant howl of a wolf echoing through the trees, a reminder that the world beyond these walls was far larger than the fear that had kept me safe. A sudden crack split the cabin as a branch smashed against the door, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. The stranger's eyes flicked toward the break, his grip tightening on the satchel. "Mara is already here," he hissed. "She sends scouts to the stone circle. She'll be waiting for the sunrise, and she'll have you both at her mercy if you don't act now." Ryder lunged again, this time not for the knife, but for the key, his fingers closing around the brass. I stepped back, the notebook slipping from my coat, its pages fanning out like a flock of nervous birds. The runes flared a violent green, each line a blinding accusation. I felt a cold sweat bead at my temple, my breath coming in shallow pulls that tasted of pine and fear. "Ryder," I whispered, the name a prayer. "If we keep the key, we're gambling with everything: my career, the gala, the promotion, my reputation." My eyes landed on the parchment with Mara's schedule. "What if we can turn this into leverage? Use the council to expose the broker, expose Mara, protect Leela." He cut me off, his voice low, edged with desperation. "You think you can negotiate with a pack that worships blood? You think a corporate board can stand up to a Wolf Queen's assassin?" The scar on his hand glowed a sickly green, as if the runes were accusing him of believing he could outmaneuver his own nature. The stranger stepped forward, pulling a leather-bound ledger from his satchel. He spread it across the floor, the pages revealing a list of contracts, names of other humans who had signed similar pacts, and a column marked expired. One name caught my eye: Evelyn Harrow, a name I recognized from a scandal at Blackthorn years ago. A cold realization crept up my spine. The broker had been feeding the pack a network of human alpha marriages, using them to destabilize both worlds. Evelyn's case was covered up, the stranger said, his voice a low growl. "She died in a fire after her contract was dissolved. The pack used that as a warning. They won't let us break this without a price." Ryder's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening. "Then we have to burn the contract ourselves." He reached for the dagger hidden in his boot, the metal humming as if it resonated with the runes. "I can't," I whispered, the words snapping like brittle twigs. "I can't risk another fire. I can't risk Leela. I can't." My voice broke, the silver sigil flaring a violent green that lit my palm. The runes on the walls pulsed, a furious chorus demanding truth. I looked at Ryder, seeing the conflict etched into his scar, the fear of losing Leela mirrored in the tremor of his hand. I realized I was holding the key, the literal key, but also the metaphorical one, our chance to choose a future that didn't hinge on sacrifice or deceit. "Ryder," I said, the words trembling, "if you leave with Leela, I'll stay and face whatever comes. I'll let the contract dissolve. I'll give up the promotion, the gala. I'll let the pack think they won." My breath fogged in the cold air, each exhale a silent surrender. "But if you stay, if you keep fighting for the pack, I can't be the one to hold you back. We both need to stop running from the same fear." He stared at me, the scar catching firelight, his eyes flickering between love and obligation. The runes flared a blinding white, the cabin trembling as if the ancient magic itself recognized the rupture. He lowered his blade, the steel clinking softly against the pine floor. "I can't abandon Leela," he said, the words heavy as a stone. "But I can't abandon you, either." He stepped back, the distance between us widening like a chasm. The stranger's hand closed around the brass key, his fingers tightening. The choice is yours, Alpha. He gestured to the key, then to the ledger, then to the door where the morning light began to seep in, painting the cabin's interior with a pale gold. Leave now, and the pack will think you chose love over duty. Stay, and Mara will have us all. A gust slammed the shutters again, sending a spray of pine resin into my nose. The runes dimmed to a soft amber, then flared a harsh green as a lie of hope flickered in my mind. I felt my fingers curl around the edge of the notebook, the paper slick with my own sweat. Fine, I said, voice barely above a whisper. I'll give you the key. You'll walk away with Leela, and I'll walk back to Manhattan with a broken contract and a shattered career. My eyes flicked to the ledger, the name Evelyn Harrow staring back at me, a promise of danger I'd never intended to inherit. But I won't let you die for a pack that uses fear as its spine. Ryder's shoulders sagged, the scar now a dull line in the firelight. He turned toward the door, his boots crunching on the pine, the weight of the key heavy in his palm. The stranger slipped a small, leather-bound notebook into my hand, its pages blank except for a single line. Mara will be waiting. He lifted his hood, the charcoal coat swallowing his silhouette, and vanished into the cold night, the wind carrying his footsteps away like a warning. I watched him go, the runes on the walls pulsing a soft amber, as if mourning the loss of a promise. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor, the scent of cedar and iron lingering in the air. I clutched the blank notebook, feeling the weight of a future I could no longer write together with him. Ryder paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the latch. He turned his head, the scar catching the last ember's glow. If you ever need help, he said, his voice a low growl, the pack will remember you. He stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft thud that echoed like a final heartbeat. I stood alone, the silver sigil on my wrist a cold line of light, the runes dimming to a melancholy amber as the first rays of sunrise slipped through the cracked window, casting the cabin in a pale, unforgiving glow. Somewhere beyond the trees, a black-fanged scout's boots crunched on frost, and the distant howl of a lone wolf rose, a mournful note that seemed to sing both of loss and of the inevitable road ahead. Eliza huddled in the cramped stall of Grand Central's lower concourse, the fluorescent hum above buzzing like a hive. The city's pulse throbbed beneath her shoes as commuters surged past, each step a reminder of deadlines she'd never quite caught. She slipped the silver notebook from her coat, thumb grazing the crisp margin where she'd scribbled the contract's clause about termination at midnight. The page felt heavier than paper, as if the ink had thickened with every oath she'd whispered to herself. A distant announcement announced a delayed train. The echo lingered, a low vibration that matched the tremor in her hand. She lifted the notebook, the scent of stale coffee from the vending machine mingling with the metallic clang of a dropped metal bucket a few feet away. A child's laugh pierced the noise, then vanished, leaving a hollow aftertaste of nostalgia she couldn't locate. Eliza pressed the notebook shut and tucked it into the pocket of her blazer, the fabric rustling like a nervous whisper. She walked toward the information desk, the polished marble cool beneath her fingertips, and asked for a map of the city's underground archives, an old municipal building rumored to hold blueprints of old railway tunnels. The clerk, a middle-aged man with ash-gray beard, slid a folded sheet across the counter. The paper smelled faintly of mildew, the edges frayed like old promises. He glanced at her badge, then at the faint silver line that still shimmered under the fluorescent light. "You'll need a key for that," he muttered, his voice a low rasp, "and the right clearance." He slipped a tarnished copper key into her palm. It was warm, as if it had just been taken from a fire. Eliza's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that she was holding something that could unlock more than a door. She turned, the crowd parting like a tide, and felt the weight of the key against her thigh. The runes she'd seen in the cabin flickered in her memory, a green flare when she'd lied, amber when truth settled. The key's teeth caught the light, throwing a thin, greenish glint on the wall behind her. A soft click sounded from a nearby locker. A woman in a navy coat opened it, revealing a stack of handwritten letters addressed to E.F. Monroe. Eliza's eyes flicked to the topmost envelope, the ink still wet, the return address a small town she hadn't visited since her mother left. She slipped the key back into her pocket, the copper cool against her skin, and stepped out onto the platform, the clatter of arriving trains a metronome to the thoughts that now raced free of contracts. Across the forest, the first gray light of dawn seeped through the pine canopy, painting the stone circle in muted silver. Ryder emerged from the cabin's doorway, the scent of pine resin still clinging to his coat, the scar on his left hand hidden beneath a leather glove. He carried the brass key in a pouch slung low on his hips, the metal heavy, vibrating with each breath he drew from the cold air. The runes on the cabin walls had dimmed to amber after their last confession, but the memory of their green flare pulsed in his mind whenever he pressed his thumb to the scar. He walked the worn path toward the council's clearing, boots crunching on frost-hardened leaves, the sound sharp as a snapped twig. A low growl rose from his chest, a reminder of the pack's expectations that still whispered in his ear. Near a moss-covered stone, a thin trail of red ink smeared on a bark, an old tracking mark used by hunters to signal a hidden watchpost. Ryder knelt, fingers tracing the line, feeling the gritty texture of sap beneath his fingertips. The mark led to a shallow depression where a rusted copper tube lay, its interior lined with damp moss and a faint metallic taste lingering on his tongue as he inhaled. He lifted the tube, discovering a folded parchment tucked inside, the paper brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. The notes listed names of other Alpha human bonds, dates, and a symbol, a broken wolf's head intertwined with a quill identical to the broker's seal. Ryder's eyes narrowed. The list hinted at a network far larger than his own family's plight. He tucked the parchment into his coat, the rough fabric scratching his cheek, and pressed his palm to the scar, feeling a faint thrum as if the wound itself recognized the pattern. A distant howl cracked the morning, low and mournful, reverberating through the trees like a warning. Ryder turned, scanning the horizon, where a plume of smoke rose from a clearing beyond the stone circle, a fire that had not been there when he arrived. He heard the crackle of burning pine, smelled the acrid sting of ash, and felt the heat on his back as gusts carried ember-laden wind toward him. Instinctively, he moved toward the flames, each step deliberate, the key now clutched tighter in his hand, its surface slick with condensation. He reached the edge of the fire, where a group of cloaked figures huddled, their faces hidden, voices murmuring in an ancient tongue. A faint glint caught his eye. A silver dagger lay half buried in the ash, its blade etched with the same wolf quill insignia. Ryder's hand hovered over it, the metal cold despite the surrounding heat, and he realized the dagger was a relic, a token of power that could bind or break a covenant. He slipped the dagger into his belt, the weight settling against his thigh, and stepped back, the firelight casting his silhouette into a wavering dance of shadows. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the runes on the stones pulsing a soft amber, as if measuring his choice. He stared at the key and the dagger, the scent of pine and smoke mingling, and felt a resolve settle, not because he needed to protect another, but because the weight of his own fear of becoming the Alpha he despised had grown too familiar. With a slow exhale that fogged the cold air, he turned away from the clearing, the path to the council now a line he could walk on his own terms. The rusted tube clinked against his boot as he left, a reminder that hidden tracks still lay beneath the forest floor, waiting for someone brave enough to follow them. Both Eliza and Ryder vanished into their respective mazes, each clutching a key, each hearing the faint echo of a promise that had never been spoken aloud. The city's bustle and the forest's hush lingered in their ears, each a counterpoint to the other's heartbeat, each leaving a thread of unanswered questions. Who else knows about the broker's seal? What will the council decide when the stones glow again, and whether the flames will ever truly die? Eliza slipped onto the frost-gripped grass, copper key thudding in her palm, pine resin curling in her nostrils. The stone circle glowed amber, glyphs breathing like slow hearts. Ryder emerged from the east stone, coat shredded at the shoulder, the scar on his left hand catching sunrise. He cradled the brass dagger they had left in the ash, its hilt still warm. She opened the notebook, thumb tracing the margin where she once wrote "Terminate at midnight," the page fluttering as a gust scattered pine needles across it. Ryder's breath fogged the cold air as his eyes lingered on the ink. "Thought you'd hide the key in the cabin," he murmured, boots crunching frost. A rune on the nearest stone flared green, remembering the lie they burned away. Eliza set the key on the central stone, metal sang against ancient rock, sending a tremor up her spine, the same tremor that once made her clutch deadlines. She watched Ryder raise the dagger, blade catching sunrise, and felt the scar pulse, a reminder of the pack's expectations she once feared. "Can we fix this without a council?" she asked, not at the stack of contracts in her coat, but at the thin frost line tracing the circle's edge. The wind carried a metallic tang, the scent of distant hunt, and an owl's hoot looping back. Ryder lowered the dagger, fingertips brushing stone, leaving a faint imprint. He drew a leather pouch, a folded map slipping onto the ground. The map plotted a network of circles, each marked with the same wolf quill seal, a pattern she had glimpsed in the broker's ledger. "Someone's still moving pieces," he said, eyes scanning the inked lines, runes on the outer stones dimming to amber as if approving the silence between them. Eliza slipped the notebook back into her jacket, the paper still warm, and stepped closer, pine sap staining her boots. She brushed the scar, feeling rough tissue under his skin, the faint pulse of his heartbeat matching the rhythm of the stones. Their hands lingered, the key sliding between them, metal warm from shared breath. Without a word, she laid the dagger beside the key, the two objects lying together like a promise. The runes flared white for a heartbeat, then steadied to gold, bathing the clearing in a light that lingered beyond sunrise. As first sunbeams struck the center stone, both felt contract dissolve, not by magic but by choice, still to stand together.